Good afternoon. This is the 6 degrees of cross-site scripting exploitation talk. I don't have a good pronunciation for whatever XSSploitation would be, but we thought it was clever. The talk is going to focus on cross-site scripting and the combination of that plus native code vulnerabilities. I'm Dan Moniz. This is HD Moore. You've seen HD Moore and the other two previous talks he's given today, of course from Metasploit. To give an introduction of what the rest of the talk is going to be, we really focus on conversation in the talk as opposed to having a lot of slides. The primary reason being that this talk is really sort of a proof of concept kind of talk. I started doing this with an OWASP talk that I was asked to present in April in San Jose in California. And I had to come up with a topic. And one of the topics I was thinking about was MySpace. Specifically, I was thinking about cross-site scripting and the problems that cross-site scripting has, and also the fact that there are very few case studies of really interesting cross-site scripting exploits, except for Sammy is my hero and MySpace. So by a show of hands, who is like vaguely familiar with the Sammy is my hero hack? Sweet, you're all in the right talk, great. So it's basically just me as one guy who thought it was an interesting topic. And when I gave the talk at OWASP, I was trying to think about, okay, I can talk about a case study which is Sammy is my hero to a bunch of people who may not be as familiar with it as people in this community are. But you know, what's new to say there, right? And luckily for me, HD Moore had done a whole bunch of work on a tool called Hamachi, which he released at CanSec West, just before I gave the talk at OWASP. And I wasn't actually at CanSec West this year due to other obligations, but having heard about it and it made the news, of course, it's everything. By the way, HD just got on the front page of Marketplace in the Wall Street Journal. So, I mean, clearly, the guy makes news, right? He's a rainmaker. So I heard about Hamachi, I knew about HD, and so I was like, well, that's interesting. You know, fuzzing browsers just with DHTML and finding bugs that potentially are exploitable. Combine that with cross-site scripting, and what the Sammy is my hero hack does specifically is combine cross-site scripting as a broad category of vulnerabilities in web applications with ridiculously popular sites, right? And that's not a factor of cross-site scripting, that's just an artifact of MySpace. And MySpace, not to pick on them, it's just that this is what happened to happen, right? I mean, it could be any other popular site. MySpace just happens to be really good at their job. So that's what we say. It's basically using cross-site scripting in concert with ridiculously popular web content as a viral infection platform. That's really the idea, the kernel of the entire talk. And so why do we talk about this? Are we out to make life horrible for people who run really popular websites? No, we're not. I mean, honestly, we're really not. What we're trying to do instead is to think about how attackers with criminal motivation and profit to be made, and there's a lot of them out there that are currently using cross-site scripting, which we get into in a little bit, is a problem. And people, you know, again, this is the common thread, right? Think like an attacker. That's what we always tell people who are in IT security who don't necessarily interact with the hacker community or the BlackHat community. And so that's really what the talk's about. There we go.
So first off, anyone who does exploit development, the first thing they're going to say when they hear about a cross-site scripting vulnerability is, why does this matter? No one freaking cares about cross-site scripting bugs. I mean, what was the last time you saw a cross-site scripting bug show up on BugTrack you actually cared about? Most people I know believe that cross-site scripting issues and kind of these like crappy low-end web vulnerabilities should be pushed off to their own, you know, dedicated list, so the rest of us don't have to sort through them all day. But the reality is people can actually use these things for, you know, make money and exploit things and integrate with other products, or excuse me, with other attacks. And that's really what we want to talk about today. It's not so much how, you know, cross-site scripting is bad and everyone's vulnerable, but how you can actually use that as a platform to doing more interesting things. Rich content's become a huge thing lately. Any website that tries to allow the user to provide, you know, some kind of rich content like bold tags, smiley faces, injection of images, Flash applications are a big one. Also opens the door for things like cross-site scripting and kind of like forced browsing and taking control of any user browser that happens to visit that control of that site. It affects, you know, all this widely deployed software, everything from, you know, Blogger allows you to inject JavaScript stuff in style tags, excuse me, not Blogger, WordPress. And just about any of these web applications and forums have at least one way you can bypass JavaScript filtering to inject, you know, arbitrary scripting code. And people are actually using this now to make money by doing things like drive-by malware installations, where they actually abuse cross-site scripting bugs in combination with things like banner ads and forums and blog spam to automatically install malware and make money off people who actually visit these sites. So that's really why we think it matters and kind of where this talk is going.
So to start off, what we wanted to do initially was to do sort of a review of major cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that people have heard of, that people know about. And my personal interest was in picking ones that have a lot of detail in order to explain them to an audience which generally doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty of these things. This is not that audience, right? I mean, as by the show of hands, clearly people are broadly familiar with the SAMI hacks specifically. But to go over it in brief, so the SAMI is my hero. I won't really call it an attack. I mean, I don't really believe that he meant it as an attack in any real sense of the word. But MySpace was the target, right? It was an attempt to tweak MySpace and to fiddle with what he could do. The injection was via cross-site scripting. The actual attack itself performed both cross-site scripting and then also cross-site request forgery, which is the ability essentially to make requests across sites without necessarily injecting script content, which gets to be sort of a key point later in the presentation. The payload is entirely JavaScript. There is nothing in his code and in the actual SAMI is my hero hack/worm that is not JavaScript. It is entirely JavaScript. It is self-replicating code only. By virtue of being JavaScript, the only thing that this does is replicate itself across, in the case of this particular hack, individual user accounts in MySpace. Now that's, by saying only, I'm not saying it isn't important. It's very, very important. But by saying only, what I mean is that there isn't anything other than just simple JavaScript code that's going to run and execute in the browser. So if you can constrain the amount of JavaScript that runs or constrain the type of JavaScript that runs, that would affect the ability of this to propagate. But it is notably JavaScript that self-replicates on a site with around 70 million vulnerable users. So, 70 million is kind of a large number. And these numbers are sort of my guess. The last published information I have for MySpace was that they were around, I think, 30 million registered users, million members, whatever, around October, around the time he did this. And then they later came out with a statistic saying that they add around about 5 million new users a month. So I just kind of, aggregated over time and kind of allowed for different things to happen.
So the way that SAMI works is interesting because it's not just, stupid cross-site scripting. A lot of people don't care about cross-site scripting because they don't realize what you can really use it for. Cross-site scripting, when people, especially in the security community, demonstrate it, is usually a little script tag that pops something up showing your cookie or showing that it can redirect you to another site. And while that's a really good demonstration of, a quick demonstration of what JavaScript injection can do, it's not really the extent of it. SAMI worked by putting a style tag onto, a style parameter onto a div tag that told it to execute a JavaScript chunk of code. That chunk of code was encoded using the decimal to ASCII conversion stuff that's built into JavaScript. And from there, it actually created the XML HTTP object to basically forge requests from the client back to the server. And that's important because once you can do arbitrary XML HTTP requests from inside the browser, you are that user's browser. Anything that user currently has access to on that website's context, you can do whatever you like to on the site. You can post to forum variables. The only thing that you really can't do at that point is something that require like image verification from the user. And even still, there's ways to forge them and just typing it in for you. So at that point, you are the user's browser. You control all their settings. If the SAMI decided to if the SAMI worm targeted the authentication or the password change form, they could actually reset everyone's password of the entire website instead of just doing, just propagating from profile to profile. Or installing something that after a certain time would run, like using the JavaScript date command or date function. I mean, there's a lot more evil things that could have happened with this that didn't happen, but the key point is once you have that type of injection, any sort of JavaScript inclusion into a browser, you have full control of that user's browser in the context of that website. And your limits are, whatever the limits of the website happen to be.
And just to, before I move on to this slide, I just want to reiterate exactly everything he just said in terms of the real issue here is that you have a programmatic interface to control everything the user would normally do themselves transparently, right? Really one way to think about this, and this is a bit of hyperbole, is really the ability to do XML HTTP requests behind the user's back is like back orifice for all websites everywhere, right? If you think about it, if you can talk behind a user's back and automate pretty much everything they can do while they're already authenticated on the site, you own them. For people, anybody here attend Jeremiah Grossman's talk? Anybody see his talk? A couple of people have? Okay, great. He did a talk, notably our talk, if you looked at the presentation descriptions, they seem a little similar. His talk is excellent. If you haven't talked to him or if you haven't seen it, I definitely encourage you to read the slides and check out the details. Basically what he talked about with TC was essentially JavaScript, pure JavaScript code that he injected via cross-site scripting to essentially create a scanning and vulnerability assessment platform inside the browser. And his target is internal corporate networks. right? This is not that, but it is very important to point out. I made the whole rigmarole earlier about it's only JavaScript, but that shows you exactly what you can do with JavaScript, right? You can create essentially, you can replicate 70% of Nmap and then other things, and then look for other ownable browsers, which you can also own through XML HTTP and other behind-the-scenes methods.
And the further we go into this with, actually operating systems, that people also talk about eventually making your operating system a website, or using, Web 2.0 technology. I don't know if that's trademarked or not, so I probably shouldn't say that. But Web X.0 technology.
O'Reilly may be upset with you.
Right. Okay. Well, I can run fast, so. So when basically using all this, behind the back scripting interaction with the website to basically create, rich user interfaces, rich applications, and kind of full operating systems the user can browse to. Well, what happens when you have a cross-site scripting vulnerability in your web OS? When you have all your personal documents, all your finance documents, everything else you have is now stored on that website, and the second you have a single cross-site scripting vuln, all that data becomes exposed to the user. So whenever you hear anyone talk about how great, this Web 2.0 crap is, and how you'd love to see an operating system that's built into a web page, kind of point out the JavaScript and cross-site scripting issue, because it's so easy to steal all that data. Sorry, that was kind of.
No, that's exactly what we're trying to talk about, right? I mean, and that's really where this is, right? I mean, he just mentioned Web 2.0 and the idea of having all of your documents in one place. And as he's saying this, I'm thinking to myself, this sounds an awfully lot like, I don't know, Gmail. Google Desktop.
The Google platform.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Not to say, I mean, this is not like, and we're not saying that we're looking to target those people, or that we have code that works against like Google Desktop or Gmail or anything like that. But really, it is the metaphor, right? There's a lot to be said about putting everything on the web and making it universally available. But obviously the trade-off is now it's universally available, right? There's obviously like a certain cutoff point at which there is like a cost-benefit analysis that has to be made. So another example that I wanted to mention just briefly is JS Yammer. I'm going to say it's Yammer. I don't really know if there's a proper pronunciation. But very briefly, this was just a simple, I won't say simple, but this is a cross-site scripting vulnerability that hit Yahoo Mail. And the only reason we really bring it out in this particular instance is though Yahoo Mail is not what I would normally consider a viral site, and I get into my definition of viral later, but I just wanted to bring it up as another example of like MySpace. In this room, who uses MySpace or has checked out MySpace for non-SAMI related reasons?
We won't laugh at you.
Yeah, seriously, I'm on MySpace, so I'm first among the guilty. Okay, a few people, not very many, but a few. So MySpace doesn't necessarily ring very loudly with a lot of communities, especially the corporate community, right? I mean, however, webmail, broadly applicable in translation, in internationalization to something like 70% of the world's audience, i.e. Yahoo Mail, right, does, right? Because either they use Yahoo Mail themselves for the ability to send emails to people outside the corporate firewall, or they know somebody who uses Yahoo email, or they understand that a webmail application is a webmail application is a webmail application. And in this case, JS Yammer basically allowed, it's a really simple kind of attack, but basically it allowed them to gather credentials from people who are logging into Yahoo Mail. Right? I don't get into any more detail than that. There's plenty of stuff to look at. It is not as detailed as the Sambi worm, but it does go into a little bit more than I'm going into here. Now, I'm going to hand it off to HD to talk about this unpronounceable one. But this is really, the thing I want to highlight before I hand it over is just, this is really the first, I'll call this like version 0 of what we were thinking about. This happened after we put this talk together. This happened like, what, last week, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, a week and a half ago.
Week and a half ago. So like we're talking, HD is in Texas, I'm in California, and so we're talking and we're trying to get everything together, and then this happens. And it's great for a certain reason because it points out exactly what we're afraid of, and that this is the harbinger of. Because one thing I will mention is that, again, the talk is a combination of cross-site scripting, viral sites, and browser vulnerabilities. And WMF is not a browser vulnerability per se, but it is the harbinger of native code